and thanks. Thanks to organizers and grant deciders for bringing us here, and thank you to all the presenters. We have some little packets of Kleenex that you can pass around because we're going to show some video of a sad story. And if you're like us and given over to crying easily, it might be helpful. So you've been trigger warned, right? So we're conducting a hybrid sociological and philosophical study based on participant observation, document analysis, and semi-structured interviews with a purposive sample. Actually, there's a lot of real quantitative researchers here, so sample was in scare quotes. There's nothing random about this. Of conservative Christians who are engaging in conversations about their church's spiritual violence against lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people, and their routes to reconciliation. In spiritual violence, the religious teachings, texts, symbols, and leaders that are supposed to foster a loving relationship with God instead lead a person to experience God as unloving or hostile. One particularly pervasive kind of spiritual violence directed at LGBT Christians in particular is sacramental shame, demanding that they constantly display shame as a sign that they've not turned their backs on God. We've been investigating how the self is harmed by the spiritual violence of sacramental shame, as well as how perpetrators and victims can both overcome these institutional abuses and acquire the motivation to cultivate such virtues as compassion, humility, and authentic love that can serve as counterforces to this form of violence. We began our collaboration with the three central research questions. Question one was, how does spiritual violence erect barriers to virtue development, both for victims of sacramental shame and for those who actively dispense this shame? Question two was, what enables LGBT church members to overcome the spiritual violence of sacramental shame, to experience God as loving rather than hostile, and to be able to engage in compassionate service to others? And question three was, what motivates non-LGBT Christians to stop this shaming and move towards authentic Christian love, but by their own standards? We'll spend most of our time talking about where we've come to so far, but first we'll briefly address the more logistical questions that we've been asked. And then at the end, we're going to talk briefly about some of the directions our research is taking us beyond our initial questions. So in terms of deep integration, we've both been very pleased with our collaboration. Theresa's joined me in conducting participant observation, and attending fieldworks together has enriched our observations and our theorization. She's also been learning how to conduct interviews, and will begin conducting them on her own soon. As we began, we needed to conceptualize what shame itself actually is, so we brought into conversation the standing literatures on shame from the sociology of emotions, queer theory, and philosophy, as well as some from theology and psychology, and found some strong commonalities with which to build our foundation. Our styles of working have been complementing each other well, and we keep notes on what we've been reading and our sort of thoughts as we go in shared Dropbox files, so that we're constantly updating each other pretty much daily on what we've done, and then we've been meeting as we go. One of the things that we've been doing is attending bi-weekly meetings of a local organization in Chicago, and so we meet on Mondays before that meeting to get each other up to date, and then we both conduct field work with that organization. We've also been attending national conferences of organizations such as the Gay Christian Network and the Reformation Project, and being able to talk about what we're experiencing as we're experiencing it and theorizing as we're there has been really rewarding as well. We predicted that we would have 72 interviews completed by May 31st, and we have 57. These range from an hour to 3.5 hours, but are usually about 90 minutes to 2 hours. We also have 250 combined hours of participant observation. We realized in terms of obstacles that we were hearing mostly from white cisgender, meaning not transgender people. So we've decided to address this obstacle by taking some time and resources to focus on recruiting interviewees who are people of color and or trans. Because of the racist dynamics of sexual shame, we were thinking that it might help to have a queer person of color to conduct some of those conversations. So we've hired a consultant who is Black and queer and one of the directors of the local organization to conduct some interviews and focus groups for us. She's finishing up graduate school right now and plans to do the bulk of her data gathering in May and June, although I imagine it will also go into July. And so that will rapidly increase the number of respondents that we have. And if we can find someone whose interviewing skills are up to the task, we may recruit a consultant who's trans and Christian to conduct some of this work as well. All right, now I'll hand it over to Theresa.
All right. So in terms of deliverables, we committed to a book which will be pitched to a lay public audience and to at least 2 scholarly articles. So far, Dawne has given 2 public lectures about this work and begun drafting a book prospectus. And we've had a proposal accepted for a paper on the gender and sexual politics of this movement for the Social Science History Association Conference, which is this November. We'll then develop this paper and submit it to the American Sociological Association in January of 2017. I've taken the lead in drafting a paper on shame and spiritual violence, which has also been reflective of our process of working out our view of shame and our understanding of shame. We plan to submit this paper to a Christian ethics journal this summer. We also plan to submit a paper to a special issue of Hypatia, which is a feminist philosophy journal, which is on the politics of shame, and that's due December 1st. We're both contributing to all 3 of these papers and to the book. We didn't plan for the book to be completed by the end of the grant period, but it will be in pretty good shape. We didn't plan to have any of it drafted at this point, but we have 2 chapters drafted and considerable work toward 2 others. All right, so the project. Now we want to talk a little bit about the substance of what we're finding. So our first research question asked how sacramental shame erected barriers to virtue development for both victims and perpetrators of this mode of violence. And in order to answer these questions, we really needed to understand shame, its healthy manifestations, its relationship to sin in conventional conservative Christian thought, and how shame becomes toxic. So shame is a really complex emotion, it turns out, and there are competing accounts of this emotion in the literature that we have consulted, but we have found convergence across disciplines on an account of shame that really resonates with the experience of the participants and interviewees that we've engaged with and has a lot of explanatory power for their experience of shame in this context. So that's the account we're working with and building from. And on this account, shame is the fear of a break in the social bond that arises when a person feels unworthy of connection or relationship on the basis of some feature of the self. There is an element of powerlessness when a person experiences shame. They feel as if they have no control over their identity, but are instead wholly reduced to or defined by some often negatively judged feature of the self that threatens to disqualify them from a community of meaning. And so many scholars are distinguishing guilt and shame, thinking that guilt is a feeling that tracks a bad action. I feel bad about an action I've done, about a moral transgression, whereas shame, even if it's about a moral transgression, is really directed at a sense of core badness in the self, that there's something bad about me that's threatening to break the social bond. The literature we've consulted is also divided on the question of whether there is such a thing as healthy shame, or whether shame is a positive moral emotion, and we're still working out our own view on this question. We lean toward thinking that shame does have positive valence, even though it is an unpleasant emotional experience. It enjoins us to preserve our social bonds and be worthy of love. As philosopher Krista Thomason points out, liability to shame involves awareness that other people matter in our self-construction. At the same time, our study provides a very clear example of how easily shame can become toxic and undercut virtue development, both for those who experience the shaming and for those who are dispensing this shame. So we originally hypothesized that for victims, sacramental shame erects barriers to Christian virtue development by making them excessively focus inward in order to fix themselves. And overwhelmingly, the evidence from our study supports this hypothesis. The shame that many of our respondents have experienced leads them to extreme forms of isolation and disconnection from others, or to self-destructive expressions of agency. Those dispensing this shame, that is sort of perpetrators of these shaming practices, are also inhibited in virtue development, and especially in their ability to cultivate authentic Christian love. We have found that they are vulnerable to the vices of domination, including arrogance, and, as we will discuss later, of enacting distorted and harmful, and therefore false, forms of love. And after the talk yesterday on humility and its contrary vices of pride, we are now also, our minds are kind of twirling with this idea that some of the vices of pride that were mentioned are really operative among those that are actively shaming LGBT church members. So we're sort of now eager to pursue that line of thinking as well. Some of the authors we've been engaging discuss what makes shame toxic, but none fully develops the concept. Drawing from James Fowler, James Bronson sees toxic shame in this context, arising from the ambiguous messages that LGBT conservative Christians receive from their churches and families, such as love the sinner but hate the sin, and fallen but not sinful. But Bronson does not say what it is about this ambiguity that is toxic. So it seems likely to us that sacramental shame becomes toxic in part because first it attacks people's ability to relate to others, and second, it does this in the context of loving relationships. So that is the very relationships that are teaching people how to relate and how to love others are also telling Christians who are attracted to people of their same sex that their capacity to love is damaged and dangerous, and are telling trans and gender nonconforming Christians that their way of experiencing their own bodies distances them from God and other people. LGBT people also often receive the less sophisticated message that they are fundamentally unlovable, that even though God's love is unconditional for everyone, including murderers, God hates who they are and refuses to hear their most ardent prayers to be acceptable and worthy. These messages take away what Goffman calls a person's footing, which is necessary to be able to participate in any interaction. So now, back to Dawne.
All right. So we wanted to avoid creating the picture that what we're talking about are just obviously abusive and oppressive relationships. We're talking about people in sincere, loving relationships who are conveying this shame as one important expression of their deep love. So we want to share with you some pieces of the story of Rob and Linda Robertson, a conservative Christian couple from Seattle, and their late son, Ryan. The Robertsons have posted their story on the internet and spoken at a number of conservative Christian venues about Ryan's experience and theirs after he came out to them. They gave this talk at a regional training conference sponsored by the Reformation Project in June of 2015, where it was live streamed and posted on YouTube. So I was there for that, but it was before the grant began, so it's like it never happened. Their story illustrates some of the points that we want to discuss with you, including how shame can become toxic in conditions of love, but also how relationships can be restored and how people can end harmful shaming practices. So yeah, like when they gave this talk, there was not a dry eye in the room, and Theresa and I, every time we watch even a little clip of the video, we're like, so we don't mean to be manipulative with this, but they give a particularly succinct version of the story that everybody that we're talking to in this whole project pretty much has some version of. Okay, so they started by talking about the day in 2001 when Ryan, who was 12 at the time, told his mom he was gay over instant messenger as she was getting ready for his sister's birthday party. So in the next slide, they're going to start speaking, and they will have just shown up on a big screen, line by line, the AOL conversation. And so then that's what they're looking at when they start the video, and then they start talking.
We were completely shocked. Not that we didn't know and love gay people. My only brother had come out to us several years before, and we adored him. But our oldest son, Ryan, he was unafraid of anything, tough as nails and all boy. We had not seen this coming. It was one thing to love my gay brother. Having a gay son felt like a completely different thing.
Right, so here we see a bit of conventional conservative Christian gender theory at work. This worldview maintains that God created gender as a natural binary, like a natural opposition, but that being not just trans, but lesbian, gay, or bisexual as well is the result of improper gender socialization and can be cured by re-socialization. We'll pursue the many questions this narrative raises in one of the papers that we mentioned and in the book. The story for heterosexual trans people is a little different from that told for sexual minorities, but the stories are intertwined because they see it as all one big problem, which is why we need more interviews with trans people to sort of trace out the differences. Now, it's clear that the Robertsons accepted this narrative from their surprise and doubt that Ryan could be gay because they saw him as masculine, as fearless, and all boy. And we'll see echoes of this narrative a bit later when they detail their efforts to help change his orientation. Now, in the conventional conservative Christian narrative, homosexuality is not an aspect of how a person relates to others, but a temptation to sexual sin that can be resisted and outgrown with faith and concerted effort. Homo-negative conservative Christians think they understand the sacrifices that they demand of LGBT people because they think they're asking them to sacrifice nothing more than sinful temptations. So we'll let the Robertsons continue.
We still had a great deal of love for Ryan, but the emotion that overwhelmed us, kept us awake at night, and sadly influenced all of our reactions over the next 6 years was fear. We said all of the things that we thought loving Christian parents who believe the Bible, the Word of God, should say. We love you. We will always love you. And this is hard, really hard.
But we know what God says about this.
Can you get it any louder?
You're gonna
People
have
are
to make some
signaling.
really difficult choices.
We love you. We couldn't love you more.
But there's other men who have faced the same struggle, and God has worked in them to change their desires. We'll get their books, we'll listen to their testimonies, and we'll trust God with this.
Can I just do it here?
We love you. We are so glad that you are our son.
But you're only 12, and your sexual orientation is still developing. The feelings you have had for other guys don't make you gay. You don't know who you are yet. Your identity is not that you're gay anyway. You are a child of God.
We love you. Nothing will change that.
But if you're going to follow Jesus, holiness is your only option. Since you know what the Bible says, and since you want to follow God, embracing your sexuality is not an option.
We thought we understood the magnitude of the sacrifice that we and God were asking for. And this sacrifice we knew would lead to the abundant life, perfect peace, and eternal rewards, even if it was incredibly difficult.
Was everybody able to get the gist of that? At least that one turned out a little quieter than the other ones for some reason, but I think you'll be able to hear the other ones better. So the Robertsons clearly loved their son and tried to make that clear to him throughout his teen years. They desperately wanted him to have a good life, to belong in the church, to be a man of God. In the conventional conservative Christian thought, shame is an important corrective to sin that all people are tempted by. Shame helps a person to refrain from sin and indicates that they desire to do and be better, that they want to be in right relationship with God and other people. Straight conservative Christians, straight and cisgender conservative Christians, will often talk about their own struggles with adultery, pornography, alcoholism, and the like. And they might find these struggles constant and difficult. Someone with a serious porn habit might find it difficult to stop, but is not generally harmed by stopping. And in fact, cessation of obsessive porn use or addictive behaviors usually restores a person's capacity to have relationships. In the sin framework, sinners experience shame for their sin, which leads them to change their behaviors and fight temptation so that they can thrive by allowing their relationships to thrive. The sin lens also affects how people think about love. In conservative Christian thought, people want those they love to be free from sin, and part of their responsibility in loving them is helping them to sin no more, to support their struggle against sin. They don't just stand by and watch those they love ruin their lives. The Robertsons' testimony eloquently shares the love that went into their discussions with Ryan throughout his teen years. Now, in the next clip, they're talking about Ryan and what he and they did after he came out to them.
Ryan had always felt intensely drawn to spiritual things. He desired to please God above all else. So, for the first 6 years, again and again and again, he chose Jesus. Like so many others before him, he pleaded with God to help him be attracted to girls. He memorized scripture, lots of it, met with his youth pastor weekly, and went to all the youth group events and Bible studies. He chose to get baptized, and he filled journals with his prayers. He read all the Christian books that explained where his gay feelings came from and dove into counseling to further discover the origin of his unwanted attraction to other guys. He worked through difficult conflict resolution with Rob and I, and invested, and Rob and I invested even more deeply in his friendships with other guys, straight guys, just like the reparative therapy experts advised. Ryan even came out to his entire youth group, giving his testimony before over 80 teenagers and sharing by memory verse after verse that God had used to speak to him. Rob and I, too, did everything we could to help Ryan seek healing and holiness. We read all the books about how we might have influenced Ryan negatively, and we took the recommended steps. We facilitated all kinds of masculine activities and friendships, as well as actively supporting the many efforts Ryan was making to seek God and to engage in spiritual things. Christian summer camps, guitar lessons with godly role models, and we always said yes to rides to church and to his discipleship group leader's house. And we prayed. Oh, how we prayed. We wanted to be like the woman in the parable who keeps bothering the judge so often that he finally relents. We all believed with great faith that the God of the universe, the God for whom nothing is impossible, could easily make Ryan straight. But he did not. Though our hearts may have been good, we truly thought what we were doing was loving.
All right, so like Ryan, many LGBT Christians love God with all their hearts, souls, and minds and pray for God to make them straight or cisgender, and still they are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. If you ask most LGBT Christians, they would say they have not turned their backs on God, and in fact, a lot of them often feel like maybe he turned his back on them. We saw this in the Robertsons' testimony. Ryan was drawn to spiritual things and loved God above all else. He pleaded with God to help him to be attracted to girls, sought out counseling, and with his parents did everything the conventional conservative church claimed they should do to cure his gayness and restore his proper gender identity. His parents didn't realize that they were in effect telling Ryan that God hated his very capacity to relate to other people so much that God wouldn't even hear Ryan's pleas to change. Go back to Theresa.
Okay. So in the case of LGBT people, we're finding that shame does not work the way conservative Christian thought supposes it does. It's not leading to humility, to love, to restored relationship. And we think this fact suggests that sin is the wrong analogy or the wrong lens for understanding homosexuality and gender variance. Part of the reason that the enormous conservative Christian umbrella organization for ex-gay ministries, Exodus, closed its doors in 2013 was that its president and board, people who had given their lives to the ex-gay movement, came to realize that struggling to be not gay was not creating a lot of flourishing. When our LGBT conservative Christian respondents tried to embrace the sin framework and resist their sexual orientations, and when our transgender respondents tried to resist their sense of their own gender, they did not experience a deeper relationship to God or to other people, and they did not flourish. In fact, they report experiencing the absence of God, the inability to connect with other people, and they also report extreme physical symptoms, including debilitating anxiety, heart failure, untreatable asthma attacks, severe autoimmune disorders, eating disorders, suicidality, and like Ryan, addiction. Rather than addressing behaviors that break relationship, treating LGBT as sinful attacks people's very capacity to relate in the first place. And not just with potential romantic partners, but with anyone, because relationships are all rooted in a person's ability to form social bonds, to be open to deep connections with other people. So we think that sacramental shame is, in effect, an act of abuse that's masking as love. Instead of fostering social bonds, it breaks them and inhibits authentic love. And so just to recap, our first question was asking how sacramental shame erects barriers to virtue development, both for LGBT people and for the people dispensing the shame. And with respect to the first part of that question is where we've done most of our thinking so far. And it's the idea that this shame is attacking people's capacity to relate, that very basic capacity, and it's doing so in loving relationships. So to the extent that those relationships are early schools of virtue development, it's actually telling people they're learning that your capacity to love, your capacity to connect is so deeply flawed that has to be fixed before anything else can come. And so they're really inhibited in their ability to cultivate many important Christian virtues. So that's sort of where we're at with that piece. The Robertsons eventually came to realize this, and here's where the story starts to get sad. And we'll let them take up this piece.
We forced him to make a choice between God and being a sexual person. Choosing God practically meant living a lifetime condemned to being alone. As a teenager, he had to accept that he would never have the chance to fall in love, hold hands, have his first kiss, or share the intimacy and companionship that we as his parents enjoy. We had always told our kids that marriage was God's greatest earthly gift. But Ryan had to accept that he alone would not be offered that present. And so, just before his 18th birthday, Ryan, disillusioned, depressed, suicidal, and convinced that he would never be able to be loved by God, made a new choice. He decided to throw out his Bible and his faith at the same time, and to try searching for what he desperately wanted: peace, another way. And the way he chose to try first was drugs. We had unintentionally taught Ryan to hate his sexuality. And since sexuality cannot be separated from the self, we had taught Ryan to hate himself.
So Ryan disappeared completely from their lives for 18 months, and they didn't know whether he was alive or dead. And it was that experience that really triggered a new perspective. They state, we stopped praying for Ryan to become straight, and we started praying for Ryan to know that God loved him. So now we want to get on to the redemptive aspect of the story, which speaks to the relational nature of our next two questions about how LGBT conservative Christians overcome sacramental shame, and how heterosexual and cisgender Christians can become more motivated to love more authentically. So we'll let the Robertsons continue.
By the time our son called us, after 18 very long months of silence, God had completely changed our perspective. Because Ryan had done some pretty terrible things while using drugs, the first thing he asked me was this: "Mom, do you think you and Dad could ever forgive me?" I told him, of course, he was already forgiven. He had always been forgiven. "Mom, do you think you and Dad could ever love me again?" I told him that we had never stopped loving him, not for 1 second. We loved him then more than we had ever loved him. "Mom, do you think you and Dad could love me with a boyfriend?" Crying, I told him that we could love him with 15 boyfriends. Yeah, we just wanted him back in our lives. We just wanted to have a relationship with him again and with his boyfriend. And a new journey was begun, one of healing, restoration, open communication, and grace. Lots of grace. And God was present every step of the way, leading and guiding us, gently reminding us over and over, simply to love our son and to leave the rest up to him. Over the next 10 months, we learned to truly love our son. Period. No buts, no conditions, just because he breathes. We learned to love whoever our son loved. And it was actually easy. What I had been so afraid of became a blessing. The journey wasn't without mistakes, but we had grace for each other, and the language of apology and forgiveness became a natural part of our relationship. As our son pursued recovery from drug and alcohol addiction, we pursued him. God taught us how to love him, to rejoice over him, to be proud of the man he was becoming. We were all healing, and most importantly, Ryan began to think that if we could forgive him and love him, then maybe God could too.
So the spiritual violence part of the Robertson story is that through his faith community and his relationships with other people, Ryan learned that God didn't love him. And here we begin to see that acceptance of gayness, putting it outside of the sin narrative, leads to the possibility of loving relationships with other people and with God. And so this brings us to our second research question, which was, what enables LGBT church members to overcome the spiritual violence of sacramental shame, to experience God as loving instead of hostile, and to be able to engage in compassionate service to others? And we hypothesized that claiming an LGBT identity was what allowed people to get on with life and flourish. Our research on shame has actually enriched this hypothesis. LGBT Christians make it evident that embracing LGBT identities does not interfere with their relationships with other human beings or God, but is what actually makes those relationships possible. In the most affirming LGBT Christian framework, choosing to avow the identity and relationships one feels called to, or choosing to identify with the sex one feels called to be when it is not the sex one was assigned at birth, are ways to affirmatively turn toward God and become the new creation God intends one to be. But why? We've come to understand more deeply how claiming an LGBT identity helps a person to overcome toxic shame. So a central aspect of shame is that sense of powerlessness over one's identity. Philosophers David Velleman and Krista Thomason both talk about this, the idea that in shame, other people's perceptions of who a person is overwhelm and bury the shamed person's own felt identity about who they are and aspire to be, which generates this experience of loss of agency over one's self-definition. So in the act of claiming that identity in the face of people who deny it, a person is asserting her agency as a self-presenter. The person is saying and really owning, this is who I am. I'm gay or I'm trans, and I'm a Christian who loves God with all my heart. So really understanding that aspect of shame, that shame's targeting a person's agency as a self-presenter, helped us understand why claiming an identity and claiming a self-presentation was so helpful in overcoming shame. So what's more, not only do they retrieve a sense of agency that the shame had threatened or undermined, but over and over again, this is in so many of our participants and interviewees, they do so. They reclaim this agency because they experience God saying to them, why do you fight being who I made you to be? And they allow that voice to overcome the voices of people who are saying otherwise. They allow themselves the authority to hear God speaking to them the way that straight and cisgender conservative Protestants hear God speaking to them. Once they do that, they can actively embrace and state their own truth. They can trust their capacity to form relationships with other people, friendships, and possibly romances. And they can actively seek to be like Jesus and to serve God and others. And in doing so, they can see the church's resistance to them as the work of flawed people rather than the work of the Creator. They start to feel like God is by their side. So I'll turn it over to Dawne.
So our final question was, what motivates non-LGBT Christians to stop this shaming and move toward authentic Christian love? We hypothesized that 4 interrelated processes made this possible. The advent of sexuality since the late 19th century, the increase in positive but coercively normalizing media representations, or the rise of what's called homonormativity. The postmodern piece, right? The idea that it's harder to believe a single certain truth due to a greater mixing of people and ideas from around the world. And because of the increased existence, visibility, and contact with LGBT people and all kinds of differences, the increased possibility of relationship in Martin Buber's sense of the term with LGBT people. The historical factors are pretty well established, and we'd found reflections of them in our research last year. So we'll focus now on the thoughts we've been developing about love and relationship. It is abundantly clear that having what Buber would consider a true relationship with an LGBT person, not just knowing one, completely changes the situation for many people who do not otherwise have an LGBT-affirming worldview. We've had to specify the concept of love in order to address this question. It would be hard to dispute that the Robertsons loved Ryan, but their own narratives, animated by fear, enabled them to close themselves off to Ryan and to begin to treat him as an object or a problem to manage once he told them he was gay. They even said in the same talk, though our hearts may have been good, we truly thought what we were doing was loving, we did not even give Ryan a chance to wrestle with God, to figure out what he believed God was telling him, or what he believed Scripture was saying about his sexuality. We had firmly believed in giving each of our 4 children the space to question Christianity, to decide for themselves if they wanted to follow Jesus, to truly own their own faith. But we were way too afraid to give Ryan that room when it came to his sexuality, for fear that he'd make the wrong choice. In I and Thou, Buber distinguished an I-you intimate relationship from an I-it objectifying experience, emphasizing that the I is different across these interactions. Now, I-it experiences are necessary and take up a lot of our lives, right? Asking your partner where your keys are on the way out of the door, or a student asking a professor for help with an assignment may be I-it experiences, and there's nothing wrong with that. We need those. But ideally, we also have moments of relationship in our lives. In a relationship, Buber says, I am open to being transformed by my connection with you. My ego falls away, and I'm open to being touched by you at the core. That means that I feel your suffering. It means that I listen to you and I learn from you. When you tell me your, sorry, I'm having page juggling problems here. When you tell me your story, I respect you enough to believe you. Rather than as a clearly bounded ego, I approach you with openness to you. We can think of love as being on a scale from fully objectifying, not really love, to fully relational or authentic love. Now, if I treat someone I love as an object, the story is about me. You remain an object in my narrative about myself, as in the way I love ice cream. It exists for me. I can have it or not, put it in the freezer for later. Right? I love you, I want to have you, I want to do things with you. You're an object in my story about myself there. Now, many of the parents, pastors, and others who treat non-conforming sexual orientations and gender expressions as sinful do not think they're treating shame as a sacrament. They don't think they're destroying the people they love. They love their children, and they don't want them to go to hell or to be given over to sin. They know that their job, like that of anyone responsible for raising children, is to help them to be moral, disciplined people, even if that's not fun. But if their loved one is suffering and they don't notice or don't believe them or dismiss it, that's not relational love. It's a one-sided feeling for an object. Ryan would not have asked his parents if they could ever love him again had he not felt that they'd stopped. The Robertsons loved Ryan, but once he told them he was gay, fear drove them to turn to their church's conventional narrative, and they in effect closed their hearts to learning from his experience. Their fear was connected to their certainty about the sinfulness of being gay and closed them to learning or to hearing anything from Ryan's experience that might disrupt the conservative Christian claim that his sexual attraction was sinful. So in that way, the church was actually breaking their relationship. Fear creates that break in relationship too, but since it's fear of what it means to be LGBT, it can seem that it's the LGBT-ness that's causing the break and therefore the shame. LGBT Christians who are not otherwise abused by their parents can feel their shame compounded because their loved ones' efforts to love them don't feel like love, and because people they know to love them are telling them that their own capacity to love cannot be trusted. All of those mixed messages the Robertsons can now identify were sent in love, but were received as a break in relationship, and the fact that they did love Ryan made them all the more damaging. Back to Theresa.
All right. So what motivates people to an ethic of authentic love? And we're still working out our thinking on this piece. But relationship begets relationship. Conventionally, conservative Christian churches keep calling gay people the sign of the end times, but only to the extent that they can keep those people at a distance and prevent relationship with them. Having a real relationship shows people that the vulnerability that comes with not being in charge of the narrative is not only safe, but also rewarding. In the parlance of our respondents, it feels to them much more like what Jesus would do. And we'll argue that the relationship in Buber's sense is absolutely essential to the development of virtues such as Christian humility and love. And again, the talk yesterday on humility really got us thinking about how this sense of it's this kind of relationship that breaks down those spiritually isolating barriers, those barriers that disrupt connection, which is rooted in mutual openness and vulnerability. So we're interested in pursuing that further. But what keeps that relationship from turning into objectification? For our respondents, an experience of extreme dissonance can provoke people to seek a different resolution, and that connects also with other talks we've heard this weekend, so that's been exciting too. For the Robertsons, 18 months of not knowing whether their kid was alive or dead made them realize that their love really was without condition, that it was for him and who he was, not for their own fantasy of his future. For our respondents, there was often something, a health effect, a break in a relationship, something that created dissonance and motivated them to rethink their doctrine and promote relational love. So in closing, we thought we would talk a little bit about the ways that our research has propelled us beyond these initial research questions. So first, we're seeing some ways that this movement could help to reinvigorate progressive politics in the secular realm. So we're looking at a conservative Christian movement, but we think there is some benefit and possible benefit for reinvigorating progressive politics in the secular realm. This ethic of love is creating a sense of momentum around working for social justice, not just for an abstracted category of LGBT people or for white middle-class LGBT Americans, but for everyone, including racial, gender, and economic justice. And furthermore, this is really interesting to us, this movement has an alternative to the conventional identity politics approach to creating LGBT positive social change, where in this movement, love and humility take the place of pride and anger. In a recent talk that Dawne gave, she discussed the challenge to conventional identity politics and the possibility that a movement rooted in overcoming shame could actually help to end the counterproductive shaming tactics that often plague much secular progressive organizing. So the last chapter of our book is going to talk about this movement's potential to reinvigorate secular movements.
So two other new directions that we're finding. The conservative Christian movement that we're studying has an interesting relationship to the politics of gay normativity. Because on the one hand, it has been made possible by such politics, which have made it quite visible and evident that gay does not refer to the scary, perverted monsters that conservative Christians often try to portray. Right, and that has made it more possible for gender normative conservative Christians who are to claim gay, lesbian, and bisexual identities for themselves. This is homonormativity.
Modern Family?
Yeah. All right, so at the same time, this movement is also giving voice to bisexual and trans Christians who challenge the binary view of gender and gender complementarian theology. For instance, they're pointing out that Genesis says that God created male and female, but it also says that God created night and day, and Christians see sunrise and sunset as beautiful in their in-betweenness, not tragic signs of the fall to be avoided at all costs. Some even argue that mainstream gay organizations' erasure of bisexuality helped to strengthen the hostile ex-gay narrative, since people with stories of change could be seen as repaired former homosexuals, rather than simply people somewhere from 1 to 5 on the Kinsey scale. Finally, in a related but distinct point, we're finding a lot more physical symptoms manifesting than we ever hypothesized. The number of people, LGBTs, but also heterosexual cisgender women, we've encountered who've been hospitalized with physical symptoms is starting to attract our notice. Our paper on gender will explore heterosexual and cisgender shame, not just about the things that rupture relationships, but about the things that everyone has to repress in order to conform to the binary gender narrative. It really seems that conservative Christian thought on gender and sexuality is hitting a point where it can't sustain itself. So deeply is it harming its own subscribers. We haven't gotten very far into this exploration, but we'd be very happy to hear your questions and ideas on this and any other piece of what we've presented. So thank you very much for your attention.
I just wanted to make more of a comment and a question for you to consider, that from looking at shame anthropologically across a variety of different cultures and contexts, it really seems like it's often a mechanism of social control. So I think your example showed that so very well, as these parents, you know, not intending it that way, but nonetheless sort of it could be analyzed that way to really apply this strongly to their son. So just a comment to sort of phrase it in terms of a cross-cultural pattern of what shame seems to be used for. And then, of course, very interestingly is how we as individuals respond to that as something that we're very sensitive to, concerned about. And again, your example showed that so strongly.
Thank you for that. And I'll just say that has also played into our wondering if there's a positive valence to shame. Is there anything redeeming about it? And we're still grappling with that question. And so I think it's related to that too. Thank you.
So I'm curious, at the very end of your talk, you were alluding to a kind of broader conceptualization of the problem of shame connected to theology in religious context that might span beyond particular gender issues. And I'm curious, to what extent do you think that these particular issues are rooted in aspects of theology, or cultural manifestation and choices with respect to the interpretation of theology, if you follow what I mean. I'm wondering if these are particular if the breadth of this notion of shame within a sort of theological framework is somehow culturally variant, so that different forms of Christianity might manifest it in different ways for different aspects of groups.
Absolutely, and there are certainly Christians who have zero problem with any of this, right? Who have zero problem with gender fluidity, who have zero problem with sexual orientation variation. It's hard for me as a sociologist to disentangle theology from culture, because the way people even when they're reading something very old, the way they understand it is shaped by what makes sense to them. The Reformation Project's task is to present to conservative Christians an interpretation of Scripture that's sound by their own methods of hermeneutics, right? So there are lots of, some of the arguments they make have been being made by liberal Christians for 50 years, but some of the arguments that liberal Christians have been making just do not hold water with conservative, evangelical theology. And so, but one of the arguments they make is to think about it like with Galileo. Galileo disproved this major foundational understanding that the sun revolved around the earth, that seemed to challenge the Bible, but it didn't challenge the Bible. It just gave us a different understanding of the creation that God made. And they see interpreting Scripture as not anti-gay, as a similar, now we have more information, we live in a different society, we live in a different world, so we can just understand God's intention for human beings in a slightly different and richer way now that we know more. And that's made possible by capitalism, by the changes in culture that have followed from capitalism. But it's very evident to a lot of people, right? It's like the scales falling from their eyes, that of course, God isn't limited by our cultural understanding of gender. Like, God's bigger than that. And to some, even conservative Christians, they're challenging the image of God as a man and things like that, right? And so their theological understandings are shaped by what they understand about creation, right? Which is their culture, basically. Does that answer your question?
And if
Thanks so much for your talk. I found your discussion of shame really helpful. I know some of the literature, but I really like the way you put it. But I was wondering, so I think it was toxic shame in particular. You talked about a fear of a break in social bonds when a person feels unworthy and so on. But I wondered if you'd given equal attention to figuring out how you want to define shaming and the act of shaming, because it's not completely obvious from the definition of shame what the act of shaming involves. I mean, is it anything that elicits this fear, or is it only certain kinds of things that do that? So anything you have to say about that would be great.
That's interesting. I think Theresa will probably have a lot more. She's furiously writing.
No, but I haven't thought that, but I think we're right. We need to do that. But we can speak to, some of that will come out in the way that we're talking about shame as a sacrament, because we're talking about the way a shaming practice in a particular community is working. And we do have something, you had articulated that initial idea, and then so I could you should speak to that.
Yeah, I was just going to say that so far it's just made sense to me to think of it in terms of just demanding the constant display of shame, right? And so and making it clear constantly, like this, and people in this movement criticize their fellow Christians' need to constantly say, well, I don't affirm you. You're a sinner. I love you, but I hate your sin, right? Like these constant, which, things that they don't have to say to their friend the embezzler or their friend the cheater on their wife, they don't have to constantly say oh, hey, how you doing? Nice weather we're having. I don't affirm the fact that you cheat on her, right? Like, they don't have to constantly say that. And so this shaming is, on the one hand saying, if you call yourself gay, you're turning your back on God. You can't do that. It is not just sinful to have these desires, it is sinful to identify with your sin by calling yourself gay, because then you're committing to your sin. And to to just make it clear that if you're not constantly saying, like, I know that same-sex sex is sinful and I can never ever do it, that if you're not constantly demonstrating that you're trying to change, or that you're trying to find a way to live in celibacy in a church for which marriage is the culmination of a person's relationship with God, then you're a sinner, you've turned your back on God, and we're going to have to ask you to leave the church, or we're going to have to ask you to step down from your position singing songs to the church or whatever,
Yeah, I mean, that seems really, really helpful. I mean, I guess if we just think very generally about shaming, it seems to have something to do with exposing someone. So it might be helpful to take a step back from the specifics of thinking about the sexuality, just think about shaming first, and then get back to the sexuality.
And the kinds of behaviors and relationships that are exposing over and over and over again. I think that's exactly right. Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful.
So I really enjoyed your talk. And one thing I was thinking about when you were showing the video of the Robertsons was, so part of the reason, I'm assuming a large part of the reason why they wanted their son to change was because they saw homosexuality as a sin. But it's also, I guess, because of their relationship with their church, right? And there were probably implications for the relationship for the church if they didn't have this particular view towards their son. Now, that changed, right? So do you know what happened with their relationship with their church? Do you know anything about how?
I did know that. I'm trying to. I'm not going to answer the question because I'm inclined to say that they've left their church, but I could be completely wrong about that. A lot of the stories that we're hearing, parents leave their church and find another church. But in some cases, part of what this movement is doing is that churches that are not affirming are actually, their leadership is saying, you know what, like, we need to we need to stop doing all of this, like, extra shaming that we do for LGBT people that we don't do for anyone else. And so there are some churches where people can stay, and where they'll have discussion groups, and maybe the leadership won't go so far as to be affirming, but sometimes the leadership is like, yeah, there's just no way that this argument holds up anymore. But sometimes the leadership can't say that because then everybody will leave their church. And there have been conservative churches where the senior pastor has said, you know what? We are going to welcome our LGBT brothers and sisters. It is what Jesus would do. I am convinced that the way we've been handling this has been all wrong, and I beg for the forgiveness of everyone that we've hurt in doing this. And then 80% of their membership leaves. Right. And so, they feel really good about what they did, but they're also, like, having to sell their building and go back to meeting in a basement someplace or something. So those are the kinds of things that happened. I don't remember exactly what happened.
And there are also, just to add to that, also some of our respondents who are LGBT decide to stay in non-affirming places to be witness, to be change makers in those communities. That's been really striking to us. And in some stories we've heard the consequence that people have lost everything. They've lost their friendships, parents or people that came out to support a neighbor. They've lost their relationships, their faith community. So it's been a range of responses that have been interesting to track.
I wanted to ask you about the positive aspect of shame. And so from the little that I know about shame, and you can probably just correct me because maybe this is incorrect, but I thought that shame, that a kind of cross-cultural feature of shame was that when you're ashamed, your reaction is to, rather than to make reparations like with guilt, with shame, it's to hide yourself and retract from the community or from the person who's judging you. So that doesn't make it seem very promising in terms of motivating us to improve social bonds.
Yeah.
So I wondered what you thought about that. But then the second part of the question is why care about shame? It seems like you really would like shame to have a positive.
Yeah, I don't know. What's my problem? Why do I want to redeem shame? But
Catholic.
I know, right? Yeah. No, that's guilt. I should want to redeem guilt now. No, I think a couple things. I think everything that you've said is in line with the reading I've done about shame too. So, and I mean, our participants, they don't find anything redeeming about shame. I mean, I've asked some of them, and they think, no, like, get rid of it. And then they're all really, 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 the work of Brene Brown, the sort of pop, that she's made some of her work popular. I mean, this is just like redemptive for a lot of people in the communities we're studying. And they're talking about, yeah, shame resilience, but let's not advocate for it. But both from some of the sociology and philosophy we're reading, so Krista Thomas, in a recent article in 2015, makes this suggestion that she calls it a liability to shame. And she says, look, shame is a dangerous moral emotion, but when you think about shamelessness, when you think about people who lack any...
Trump.
Yeah,
right, exactly.
Yeah, and so she was trying to think through what is it about shame that might be positive, and she doesn't go so far in developing it, but she says that in the same way we think a liability to grief tells us something in terms of like how we think about and value other people, a liability to shame says something about how the self recognizes that other people matter in our self-construction. And she says she thinks of it as an emotion of self-protection that protects people from self-inflation, and the kind of self-inflation that makes one a kind of, I'm the center of my universe and everybody else's, and I don't have to be accountable in certain sorts of ways. And then Paul Woodruff, interestingly, links shame with reverence. And so I'm also trying to think about that connection, and I don't have a lot to say yet about that, but I think it's connected to this idea of a self going beyond itself, this sort of self-transcendent self, recognizing that there's something else that's relevant. But yeah, it's...
Last question, Peggy.
Thank you. Thank you very much for such an interesting, heart-warming, and distressing talk.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in the role of shame, too. I tend to just not be a shame person. I don't think there's any positive thing about shame. You can have humility, you can have a lot of other things, but shame is not one of my favorites, and we can talk about that later. But I was raised in a religion, and that's partly might be why I don't believe in shame, that didn't ever focus on sin or shame, but you were not allowed to have premarital sex or extramarital sex of any sort. And if you had desires, that was okay. That didn't make you bad. It's just you weren't supposed to act on them. So coming back to the idea of celibacy and the role that celibacy plays, required of both heterosexuals in some circumstances and LGBTQ in other circumstances, if you take away the shaming part, but you still add in this requirement for celibacy, regardless of which sex you're attracted to, have you looked at the implications for that?
Yeah, and it seems like it's shaming in another way. So one of the main arguments the Reformation Project makes is that, so basically their argument is there's neither same-sex marriage nor mandatory celibacy for an entire group of people in Scripture, but which is more in keeping with the trajectory of Scripture is same-sex marriage, which can be self-giving and self-sacrificial, as opposed to taking this thing that Paul designated as an exceptional gift that some people have and making a mandate for an entire class of people. They see that as actually robbing the value of celibacy, as much as forcing something that's supposed to be a gift onto people who do not have that gift. We've talked to a small number of people in this movement among the LGBT people, and some heterosexuals claim this for themselves, but I find it unsettling. They talk about side A and side B, and the effort is that we all need to get along because we're all being attacked by our churches. But let's just give them very neutral terms. So side A would be same-sex marriage is okay, God is okay with that. Side B would be mandatory celibacy, or what they call a mixed orientation marriage, where you avow being gay, but you just marry someone of the other sex because you think God wants you to do that and that it's going to work out great. We've talked to a few side B people who were originally side B people who have come to realize that the arguments mandating celibacy just didn't really make any sense. So we were talking to one young man at the Gay Christian Network conference who he'd been side B since he came out to his parents in high school through college. He's about to graduate from college, and he was like, yeah, side B just stopped making sense because people in my church were telling me that it would be better for me to fall repeatedly and ask for forgiveness, which I hear in my secular ears as slut around.
Yeah.
Not that, I mean, and
Sexual
I would not ask
promiscuity.
for forgiveness of anybody for slutting around, but slutting around and being rueful about it constantly, as opposed to self-giving marriage. And he was just like, okay, that is so nonsensical that it cannot possibly come from God. That's got to be coming from other people. So I'm thinking about going over to side A. And we've talked with other people too, someone who's a leader in this movement who's been recognized as a side B leader for years, who's like, I'm conservative. I'm being very conservative to see if I can do this. But maybe God has a relationship in store for me in the future, and just recognizing that mandatory celibacy is one of those mixed messages, like sin, not like what's it called, fallen but not sinful, or welcoming. Like you can. It's okay to be who you are, but you can't actually, love in the way that you feel called to love, because that is not actually a calling. That's just the enemy of our souls playing with your mind. It's one of those mixed messages.